It's that time of year, my friends, the big one, summer solstice. In this video, I'm going to tell you about its history, myth, folklore, symbolism, and some things you can do to celebrate this important day in the wheel of the year. So, my friends, it's magnificent, isn't it? Look around you. Everything is in full display. Everything is just showing off. Everything is so green. I should say I'm making this video in advance. At this time this video goes out, I will be walking along the Ridgeway in South England, Britain's oldest road, and I will be finishing up in the biggest stone circle in the world, Avebury Henge, the ancient solar temple. Think Stonehenge, but without all the people dressed like tents. So summer solstice, my friends, in the pagan, contemporary pagan, you might say, wheel of the year, summer solstice, I guess, would be maybe at 12 o'clock. It's the zenith, it's the height, it's noon. It is the high point in the year. So this is the longest day. And in our calendar these days, it generally falls on about June the 21st. Now, historically, in ancient times, the builders of these megalithic monuments like Stonehenge and like Avebury would have celebrated these 2 days most of all. There's some evidence that winter solstice was the most important, but summer solstice was very important as well. Sunrise on summer solstice on June the 21st, if you were stepping back into our ancient forebears' shoes, maybe a priest standing at the very centre of Stonehenge, you would see the sun rise on the longest day just over the heel stone. The heel stone is a stone slightly outside the Stonehenge circle, and it would rise over there and shine through the great triathlon, and then a shaft of light would penetrate the centre of the stone circle. A shadow would also be cast from that heel stone that would move through that triathlon and impregnate the womb of the stone circle, some people say. There's a lot of solar symbology going on here, and clearly this solar mythos was hugely important to our forebears in this part of the world. Some people's interpretation that this day is about a union of the sky father, the sun, the rains, the lightning that fertilizes the earth mother from which life bursts forth. And you can kind of see this in some of these ancient monuments. There's this heel stone phenomena, I said, that does look all the world like a kind of shaft of impregnating light, impregnating that stone circle, and giving birth 6 months later to a new sun at the winter solstice, when the sun is about to disappear and then rises again above the horizon. This is one interpretation of these monuments. There's a similar thing that happens at Avebury as well. There's a phallic stone, and at summer solstice, it's in the inner circle of stones. It strikes a kind of cup-shaped stone that's kind of interpreted as a yoni or sacred feminine aspect. This symbology just echoes through the centuries. You think of the dagger and chalice symbology of contemporary paganism like Wicca. The Druids even do this at Stonehenge and Avebury. At sunrise, they do the dagger in the chalice thing to signify that union between divine masculine and sacred feminine that perpetuates the year, the seasonal cycles, the harvest, life itself. We're keeping that great myth going by honouring these feast days, some might say. It's clear from the alignment of a lot of these ancient monuments that the megalith builders, as we call them, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, really honoured and sanctified the summer solstice and the winter solstice, and quite often the equinoxes as well. The whole solar cycle and the agricultural cycle that it is based on. because obviously that is the source of all of their livelihood. The grain must come. So I guess what I'm saying is a lot of this contemporary practice of celebrating the summer solstice and the longest day has ancient historical precedent. We don't know what was going on in the minds of these ancient peoples, but it was some sort of solar myth. That much is clear. Since the 1970s, Druids and travellers and hippies and thrill seekers and people on the margins, the ragged edges of society, nomads, have descended on places like Stonehenge for the Stonehenge Free Festival. People have actually been gathering at Stonehenge in modern times since the 17th century, when their interest in Druidism sort of really resurfaced. So quite a long time. It's a shame these days that, well, the Stonehenge Free Festival was banned in the 70s, the Battle of the Beanfield. I'm not going to go into that, but a terrible tragedy. Real police brutality went on there. And even in more recent times, COVID was a reason to ban all the traveller vans from the Ridgeway. I remember back in the day, you would walk along the Ridgeway past all these vans and hippie buses and circus wagons and tents and all these people walking along the Ridgeway, hearing the drumming, and then descending into the stone circle. And it felt like all the world, like the spirit of the ancient festival, where people would have come from all across this island, driving cattle for sacrifice, to witness the spectacles at these ancient monuments, such as Avebury. This modern revival movement feels like it was more in the spirit of that ancient tradition than this national trust and English heritage stuff with people with sticks dressed like tents and photographing everything. That's not in the spirit of the ancient monument, in my opinion. But hey, all people are welcome. So when this video goes out, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to encounter along the Ridgeway. Maybe nothing. Maybe the peace will be nice. So the symbolism of this day, as I've already hinted, is the solar, the culmination of the solar myth. So everything is at its zenith now, and then from here it's all kind of downhill. The days get shorter and shorter and shorter until the sun nearly disappears over the horizon, and the new sun literally is born for the next year, the next cycle. So this is a time for celebration, my friends. This is a time where everything is at its peak. In the folklore, this is often reflected. We see lots of solar type mythos weaving back through the centuries in the folklore. The most recent incarnation of this, you might say, is the Oak King and the Holly King. So this is the folkloric way of looking at this. The Oak King is the personification of summer, and he grows, he waxes through the year until he is at his peak at the height of the year. Sometimes he's represented as the kind of green man in more recent kind of folk art. But just right when he's at the peak of his powers, his crown is stolen or he's defeated in battle by the Holly King, who then grows in power until the winter solstice. Some people like to say the Holly King is kind of like maybe an aspect of Father Christmas, you know, old man winter embodied, the harshness of winter. But then at winter solstice, the Oak King comes along and nicks his crown, and then the whole cycle just continues. This folklorically is probably quite a recent thing, maybe only as old as sort of the 17th or 18th century, and late, and sort of mummers plays and all that stuff. But the motif of this cosmic battle between two opposing forces representing summer and winter and the solar cycle is ancient, and we see it reflected in a lot of earlier myth. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is an interesting one. Gawain is really interesting here, you know, an Arthurian hero from the medieval, but based on earlier Celtic oral tradition. Gawain in the old Welsh material means Gwelachmai, the hawk of May. The hawk is a solar animal. Of course, in a lot of the old stories, Gawain, he waxes in strength throughout the course of the year. So he's much stronger at noon and at summer solstice. He's like a Hercules, you know, slay monsters. But then he gets weaker and weaker and weaker through the winter solstice. And at nighttime, we kind of see that in the story of Gawain and the Green Knight, which is almost a story of the regenerative cycle of life and death in the year and in humanity itself. It's winter solstice when the Green Knight strides into Arthur's court. So there's that wheel of the year cycle there as well. Another old story where we see this sky story, this solar story, is arguably Tristan and Isolde. Another another old story with a very, very ancient precedent in the oral tradition. In this story, we have Tristan, who in many ways represents the moon and the tides. If you've heard my story of Tristan and Isolde on this channel, you'll be familiar with this. Tristan is the moon. Isolde arguably is the sun in its fullness. So a reversal of the masculine and feminine archetypes usually understood with the sun and the moon here, which is interesting. And then there's King Mark, the third part in the love triangle, whose name means horse. Here is reminiscent to the old Bronze Age imagery of a gold horse pulling the disk of the sun across the sky. I think there's a very popular image from Bronze Age Scandinavia, Denmark, I think, of this old solar cycle, the horse pulling the sun and the moon across the sky in the seasons of the year. So this is Bronze Age, following shortly after the late Neolithic of the stone circles of Britain and Ireland. So we can see this story developing in history right up until the present day. Obviously, the story has evolved and changed over time, but it is interesting with contemporary practice associated with Stonehenge that there is a thread work in the folklore reaching back, maybe even as far as these ancient monuments themselves. It's impossible to tell because it is intangible heritage. Well, what is tangible then? This was a feast day, a great bonfire day in history. We can actually see that in the evidence of places like Durrington Walls, just outside Stonehenge, Woodhenge, places around Avebury, and lots of other ancient Neolithic and Bronze Age ritual centres where we can tell that huge bonfires were lit. We can actually tell, we can pinpoint it by the carbon deposits that this was at certain times of year, like winter solstice, like Beltane, like summer solstice, and always huge amounts of animals were cooked, and not even all eaten. Some of them only barely touched, tipped into great pits in the ground, into great ritual ditches, sometimes into holes that previously held standing stones or wooden posts. So a sacrificial gift to the earth, you might say. So huge amounts of feasting, huge amounts of revelry, great bonfires lit, perhaps to symbolize, mirror the sun or pay homage to it. A lot of feasting. We see that in the sort of archaeological evidence. Later in history as well, a lot of purification rites happens at this time of year, such as driving livestock past the smoke of fires to ward off disease or evil spirits, things like that. We see that at Beltane as well. So perhaps this is very common at these sort of acupuncture points of the year to do this ritual cleansing of livestock on which your livelihood depends. We see the trappings of those ancient fire festivals arguably in parts of Northern Europe right up until the 19th century. Mainly in the British Isles, in Celtic-speaking parts of Britain. So in Cornwall, still the great fires were being lit right up until the 19th century on various hillsides, one after the other, so you could see them on the hills. I believe this also happened in Scandinavia, in Sweden and Norway, until relatively recently. Lots of fires in country places, perhaps a reflection of these ancient ritual purification fires in honor of the sun. So I find that really interesting. It's worth noting as well, midsummer, when these bonfires are lit, is actually sort of around June the 24th. I think the church moved the date to the festival of St. John the Baptist. Perhaps they moved it, probably, so it wasn't on that very, very pagan day of the actual summer solstice, the astronomical summer solstice, the actual longest day. So a few days to play with there, and the sun is kind of in the same spot in the sky for all these days. So a long period for celebration. That's what solstice means, of course, sun standing still. In parts of these islands, not sure about Northern Europe, but there are certain activities on Midsummer's Day, so June the 24th I'm talking about now, that seem like they're to do with solar mythology, so perhaps a remnant of that. Things like rolling, burning barrels of tar down hills. This sort of thing also happens at Beltane and Samhain as well, perhaps to mimic the path of the sun through the sky. The imagery makes sense, even if we can't trace the tradition back in time. Also, sometimes maybe the scattering of buns and things like that on the ground. Even as late as the 18th century, in Cornwall, there was a farmer that had his best pig killed and he tipped it in a pit with other ritual offerings. So this sort of folk custom that seems to mirror earlier pagan practice. So what are some things you might do if you want to celebrate this day? This is sort of in a reconstructionist and eclectic way, but also with sort of historical precedent. Light a fire. There's historical precedent for that. Stay up and watch the sunrise, as I will be doing at Avebury Henge. If you don't have a local stone circle, I realise I'm quite privileged to have that on my doorstep. Find a hill where you can see the sun rise. Light a fire. If you're not able to light a fire, if you live in an urban area, maybe just light a candle and be up at dawn. Have a drink. There's evidence for huge feasting. Make the food you like to eat. You don't have to slaughter a whole pig, but drink some alcoholic beverage or whatever intoxicant is your intoxicant of choice. Have a good time. There's clear evidence that our ancestors did that. If you're into magic, this is a good time to practice ceremonial magic. Divination was typically done on Midsummer's Eve, so June 23rd. Ceremonial magic is probably, these high summer is a very powerful time in terms of ceremonial magic, a lot of people say. So think kind of Apollo and Helios vibes here, magic to do with healing or the arts or poetic inspiration. On the subject of poetic inspiration, William Shakespeare, I probably should have mentioned this in the folklore, Midsummer Night's Dream. Lovers going off into the forest, this fairy world interacting with the human world, drunk on love, all these elements in this play of William Shakespeare's that resonate with the pagan imagination here. Some people call the Renaissance the pagan dream of the Renaissance. The very height of Merry England and, you know, Morris dancers and green men and queens of the fairy, all of this happening in the sort of in the late medieval going into the Renaissance. A real pagan revival happening sort of 400 years ago, as I believe is happening today as well. It's funny, these things keep kind of erupting from our collective unconscious into the conscious realm of human culture. But the idea at the heart of A Midsummer Night's Dream is, of course, fairies. The solstice is one of the times that is one of those thin places, like winter solstice, like Halloween, like Beltane. All these points in the wheel of the year are thin places where spirits of the other side may walk abroad among us. So if you're having celebrations out on a hill, watch out for bad fairies, my friends. It's really interesting as well in a lot of folklore of these islands. On Midsummer's Day, this time of, you know, life and heightened sexual potency, sometimes death creeps in the folklore as well. There's certain trees and certain forests in England that at you know, midnight before the longest day, skeletons will erupt out of the ground and do a dance around these old oak trees. So the idea of death and life weaving in there, even at the height of summer, the Holly King has come along, death has pipped life to the post, and this cycle of life and death and rebirth constantly going on, and we're all part of it, all part of that mythic story. So my friends, I hope you have a great summer solstice, whatever you're doing. I'll put a video to the oak tree here, which is if you want to know any more about some oak symbolism or something else, YouTube will want you to watch. I'll see you when I get back from the Ridgeway, my friends. Ta-ta.